My name is Bruce Katz. I'm a vice president at the Brookings Institution and director of the Metropolitan Policy Program with Amy Liu. I want to invite everyone here for what I think is going to be an incredibly informative day, focusing on the arts, new growth theory, and economic development. And right off the bat, I just want to say, to Rocco and Michael and Sunil, congratulations for getting here. I mean, what you've embarked upon, I think, is absolutely necessary, which is to provide a sort of rigorous, disciplined platform for the conversation of the role that arts and culture play in cities and metropolitan areas. What you're trying to do today is not easy to do, okay? I mean, you're trying to connect academic to practice, theory to policy. We try to do this a lot at the Brookings Institution. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. But, it all comes down to what Senator Moynihan said, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts, right? Maybe even not his own theory. So I think you're making a great intellectual contribution and commitment here. And I think the reason that this is so important is that, we're living in a period, I mean, frankly, we're living in a century that's an urban age and a metropolitan century. So I would say for the past 30 or 50 years, with the exception of people like Ann Markuson and others, a good portion of the academic discipline did not focus on the whole, the collective, the city, the metropolis. They sort of dove down into segmented and compartmentalized areas of discipline. The U.S. is a very specialized kind of place. And at the end of the day, how cities function, how metropolitan areas function, the clustering effect, the concentration effect, the agglomeration effect, talent and firms and creativity, that's what drives national economies. That's what's the vehicle for environmental sustainability. Those are the agents for social inclusion, right? So cities and metropolitan areas here and abroad is the topic, is the unifying thread of this century. And arts and culture are just fundamental to quality of life, but even more important to attraction and retention of talent and providing a platform for long-term growth. So I just want to, and before I introduce Rocco, just give you one anecdote about how important this is. As some people in the audience know, my newfound obsession, though it's been an obsession for about 5 years right now, that's a long obsession, is about whether the 21st century will evolve as a network of trading cities. I mean, whether we'll go back to a period of time, pre-nation state, where cities really trade with each other and form these very special and distinctive relationships. And I was at a dinner about a month ago with the ambassador from Mexico, expecting to have a conversation about auto supply chains, right? Really exciting stuff. And he opened up the conversation and then continued the conversation, first with a discussion about the new growth theory, frankly, and the role of talent and the role of concentration, agglomeration, and then proceeded to have a conversation of how critical cultural exchange between cities, between metropolitan areas, between states, between nations is to ultimate trade, commercial exchange, and economic performance. That in many cases, cultural exchange starts as a platform. Now, this could be the second conference, right? So that we can explore all this. But I just found it remarkable, and frankly, it's been repeated in conversations, with other embassies and individuals, particularly from cities in rising nations, not the mature economies, but the rising nations, talking about the role of arts and culture as helping to establish relationships between and among cities and setting a platform for broader trade and exchange. So we're on to something here. This is the inquiry, or the area of inquiry, I think, that so many different disciplines need to come to. What makes cities work? How do cities function? And thinking across disciplines. With that, I'd like to introduce the master of ceremonies, I suppose, today, Rocco Landesman, chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. He's been the chairman of the NEA since August 2009. So congratulations for making it through this far. I mean, in a prior life, Broadway, producer, but this is the national stage. And the politics of Washington is something that it's hard to imagine anyone can really understand until they experience it. So Rocco, phenomenal tenure, and thank you for this.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks both for welcoming us this morning and for being such an extraordinary partner in planning today's convening. Bruce is one of the very first people I met with when I came into the NEA, and I came away from the meeting thinking, my God, this guy's smart. There must be something we can do with him, must be some way to interact with Bruce and Brookings, and finally, after a couple of years, here we are. I've been asked a lot recently about what I think we've been able to accomplish in my time at the NEA, the key phrase being what I think we've been able to accomplish. And today's event embodies the three most important themes, in my opinion. We've worked to make new partnerships for the agency. We have elevated the work of our Office of Research and Analysis. And we've worked to underscore the relationship between the arts and, for lack of a better phrase, the real world. As I said, I met with Bruce early on, and we began talking about what we might be able to do together. And when Michael Rushton, who co-edits the Journal of Cultural Economics at Indiana University, approached us with his interest in co-commissioning an economics series of economics papers, I felt we had the right occasion. Too often, arts research gets sneered at by other kinds of researchers as not serious. And too often, those of us in the arts leadership positions leave the research just sitting on the shelf. I think today will go a long way toward changing both of these. These are serious academics who've approached important topics with rigor. And we've invited colleagues from across the federal government, the Patent and Trademark Office, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We invited them to join with us here at the Brookings Institute to talk about how this work relates to the real world and its policy implications. Within our Office of Research and Analysis, a white paper was another one of the early things we did. The white paper was commissioned from Ann Markison, who I think is right here. It's an incredible paper. Those of you who haven't read it should by all means. But it was a white paper on creative placemaking, and it led to our signature NEA initiative, the Our Town grant program. Our look at the data within the survey of public participation in the arts about America's arts consumption via electronic media led to changes we recently made to our Arts in Media grant guidelines. So we do take research seriously, and we do use it in our policy. And James Catterall's arts education research that we published has helped the President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities as they implement their Turnaround Arts initiative that integrates arts education into overall school reform strategies. So I'm very excited to see what the result of today's conversations will be. Before I turn things back over to Bruce, so that we can begin the conversation with creative clustering, there are three NEA colleagues whom I would like to single out for during today's meetings. Sunil Iyengar, Bonnie Nichols, and Ellen Grantham. I would also like to acknowledge the great work that all of Bruce's colleagues at Brookings and, of course, Michael Rushton and Indiana University, the work that they've all done to make this possible. So let me leave things there and ask Bruce to come back up in his moderator's hat to get us started. Thanks so much. Bruce.
So first thing, there's a Twitter hashtag, NEA Brookings, if you want to tweet to the millions. If you mention, David Byrne or something, maybe people will pay attention. What we're going to try to do is have 3 presentations in a row, 15 minutes each. I would say to each of the presenters, both for this panel and for the next panel, there will be a time keeper. And so when they put up that 5-minute, 10-minute, don't sneer, don't attack, follow the rules. So we're going to start with Juan Mateos Garcia. He's a research fellow at the National Endowment for Science, Technology, and Arts in the UK, a paper entitled Capital of Culture. Then we're going to go to Stephen Shepard. He's a professor of economics at Williams College. His paper is titled Culture Shocks and Consequences. And then we'll end up with Charles Gray, professor of business economics, University of St. Thomas, paper title, Provocative, ? The Arts as a Growth Engine. So we'll start with one, and then everyone will sort of move through, keeping time, and then we'll moderate a conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Mateos. I'm a research fellow at Nesta, and I'm here to present the emerging findings from a research project that I've been working on with my colleague Hassan Bakshi at Nesta and Neil Lee, senior economist at the Work Foundation in London. This paper is called Capital of Culture, and it explores the relationship between cultural clustering and productivity in English cities. What is the motivation for this work? The motivation for this work is that over the last decades, we have seen very strong emphasis being placed on arts and culture as drivers of economic development. We have seen wonderful buildings being erected. This is the Sage Gateshead in Newcastle. We have been cities competing in festivals to become capitals of culture. This is Liverpool. Got it for 2009. We have seen a plethora of arts and cultural activities taking place in different cities. This has been very visible in England. This photo is actually from a festival that takes place in Brighton, where I live. So it's around us. And as economists and people who are concerned with cultural policy, we have decided to look a bit at the evidence base underpinning all this policy making. Basically, we want to look at how robust is the relationship between arts and culture and local productivity. And we also wanted to try to identify through which mechanisms are the arts and culture impacting on local economic development, because only that way we'll be able to enforce policymaking in this area. So the structure is simple and very academic. We have a theory, a number of theories setting out connections between arts, culture, and economic development. We are going to be examining whether the evidence supports those different theories using methods and data, which I will be telling you about. Going to be presenting some emerging findings from the research, and then I'm going to be presenting the conclusions and next steps of the work. This, I must emphasize, is work in progress. The findings are emergent, and our in terms of policy, we have implications rather than recommendations. But we set out to address that by doing more things with the data, which I will be telling you about to conclude. So what's the theory? What is the role of the arts and culture in our cities? Two main theories have been set out. The first one presents arts and culture as providers of amenities, as providers of atmospheres, experiences, basically a number of things that high human capital, highly talented, highly innovative, skilled people are looking for when they decide where to move. Basically, by attracting those people who are referred to as the creative class, the arts and culture contribute to economic development because the presence of a strong creative class then attracts high growth, innovative, high-tech, knowledge-intensive business firms, the sort of firms that everyone seems to be after. So this is one model. Another reason why the arts and culture are seen to be attractive for the creative class is because they act as proxies for atmospheres of tolerance and openness to which it's argued the creative class is attracted. The other way of thinking about the impact of arts and culture on economic development is through localized spillovers, where investments undertaken by arts and culture through their own activities, they make firms in cities more productive. How do they do this? They do this by investing on human capital, highly skilled, innovative people that then are employed in other sectors. They do this by providing organizational templates for innovation that can be imitated by other firms around them. They do this by creating atmospheres which are conducive to collaboration and knowledge sharing. And they do this very importantly, and perhaps in a way which is harder to measure, by creating expressive value, creating new histories, creating new symbols, creating new aesthetics, which are in some cases commercialized in other parts of the economy. And basically, the way these spillovers are generally described in the literature is taking short leaps, as it were. Where we see, labor flows, where we see dissemination taking place, is mostly between arts and culture and other sectors in what we will call the commercial creative economy, sectors such as publishing, sectors such as music, software publishing and video games, digital media, and so forth. And this is represented by that concentric circles model over there in that box. So this is the theory. There are many open questions about these different explanations of the impact of arts and culture on economic development. In the first story, best represented by Richard Florida's Creative Cities framework, there are many questions about the direction of causality between arts and culture and the creative class. Is it that arts and culture genuinely attract these high human capital professionals, or is it that these human capital professionals are able to support a vibrant arts and cultural scene? Does it even make sense to talk about the creative class as a monolithic construct? Are arts, designers, advertising people, software developers, engineers, lawyers part of the same class? That's many criticisms to this framework for making that assumption about all these people deciding to move to places, making those decisions to move to places on the same basis, even having the same goals. In terms of the localized spillovers research, we have a small number of suggestive studies, rarely looking at the spatial dimension, and they haven't really looked much at what's the relative importance of these different spillovers in creating economic impacts. Again, a question which is very important for policy. Something else where there's a question is about whether it is industries, that is sectors, or people who create impacts. And also, there's a dearth of research looking at these relationships between arts and culture and economic development outside of the US. In particular, in England, the situation is not great. I was doing some background work on this, and the main piece of work I could find was an MSc dissertation looking at this issue. So we're really trying to bridge that gap through our research. So what's the method and what's our data? Basically, we set out to explore empirically the relationships between cultural clustering and local productivity in 74 English cities. Our model is fairly straightforward. We look at worker wages, and we try to explain those on the basis of the presence of a cultural cluster in the city where those workers live. We measure cultural clustering using three different metrics of industries or sectors, occupations, and institutions, arts and cultural institutions. When we talk about culture, we talk about not-for-profit activities, including museums, including libraries, and including things such as visual and performing arts. So basically, this is not including what we would call the commercial cultural industries. And of course, we also include another set of variables which could explain these worker wages. We explain individual characteristics such as skills and human capital, experience, socio-demographic variables. And we also include variables, characteristics of cities that could also explain the wages of the workers who live there. We are controlling for all these things. Our data comes from official surveys of workers, official surveys of businesses, and a unique data set of 5,000 cultural institutions compiled by Culture24, which is a UK-based organization whose website you can visit at that URL. Basically, what we're exploring is simple, is whether we find, after controlling for all these different individual and city variables, whether we find a positive impact of cultural clustering on worker wages. This would suggest the existence of spillovers. Still, we would need to address the issue of causality. That is, whether it is the case that places where workers are more productive and get paid higher wages are more supportive on cultural clusters. But that's going to be one for next steps, as I'll talk about when I finish the paper. The presentation, sorry. So what are our findings? When we plot hourly wages against cultural clustering, we find a positive relationship. We find that people living in places with high levels of cultural clustering get paid higher hourly wages. This is 1.11 pounds an hour. That's what city workers in cities in the 90th cultural percentile earn above those in cities in the 10th percentile. And this is amounts, I think, to around 170 pounds a month. So it's a substantial amount, actually. However, and this is reflected in this first list of correlation results, where we simply find that cultural clustering has a positive impact on hourly wages across the board. And this is for all the different measures of cultural clustering, including occupations, employment, and institutions. However, when we include individual variables into our model, we find that the results become mixed and some impacts become insignificant. And in the case of cultural employment and cultural institutions, it becomes significant and negative. This becomes even clearer when we introduce measures of cities. Basically, what this means is that once we control for individual and city characteristics, people living in cultural clusters get paid less on average than those in other places. We interpret this as evidence of the contribution that arts and culture make to quality of life and place. People are will basically be happy to sacrifice some salary in order to live and work in places with strong arts and culture. We have also looked at whether there are any we find that people living in cities with strong commercial creative clusters get paid more on average once we control for all these individual and city-level characteristics. Whether there's a creative city premium, as it were, from living in places with strong media, entertainment, and digital clusters. And in this case, we do find basically for some reason, this is showing us negative, but actually positive coefficients. There's indeed, once we even controlling for individual and city-level characteristics, workers in creative cities get paid above the average. And this is particularly the case for people working in creative occupation clusters rather than creative industry clusters. Of course, an issue that we need to address here is whether there's a reverse causality, again, where places which are more affluent attract these creative clusters. The third thing that we examine, our fourth key finding, I think, is where we explore whether the spillovers from arts and culture are more constrained. You know, they are taking those shorter leaps, so maybe we don't see them captured in the wages of the wider economy, but we see them captured in the wages of people working in these commercial creative occupations. So basically, we look at this by looking at the interactions between cultural clustering and whether a worker is on a creative occupation or not. What this is telling us is very simple. It's whether if I am a creative worker, does it make a difference for my wages to live in a place with a strong arts and cultural cluster? And the results that we find suggest that this is indeed the case, which basically would support the idea that arts and culture generate spillovers which are beneficial for those people who are basically closer to that arts and culture. They work in commercial creative industries. And as I showed before, those people seem to have an impact on the wider economy through that creative wage premium. So what this suggests is that arts and culture might be having an indirect impact on the local economy by impacting on that creative economy around it. So the tentative conclusions coming out from this research. In the first place, we find that quality of life and place aspects, that there are important quality of life and place aspects to arts and cultural infrastructure. It's not simply a matter of trying to build a creative city and expecting high-wage people to move in. Actually, it might be the case that you get still very smart people wanting to move in and getting paid less for it, which might actually make local companies more competitive, which is, again, a beneficial impact, but not through the usual mechanism. Also, we find evidence of creative wage premiums for creative occupations. And finally, we find evidence of spillovers between arts and culture and commercial creative digital sector. This suggests that policymakers, when developing creative city policies, should pay attention to the ecosystem aspects of the cultural and creative infrastructure and the connections between arts, culture, and the commercial creative industries. In terms of next steps, this is a snapshot of work in progress. We have lots to do yet. In particular, we are going to be including more variables in our analysis. The elephant in this particular room is housing prices, which we didn't manage to include in time for this presentation. We are also going to be looking at firm-level productivity data as well as worker wages as another way of getting at the relationship between arts and cultural clustering and productivity. And we're also planning to explore causality using longitudinal historical data as well as instrumental variables, and maybe also a natural experiment using the implementation of free access policies to English museums in the UK. So I look forward to the discussion coming. Thank you very much. And that's my email. Thanks.
Thank you. This project is reporting on a paper, a research paper that's really joint product with myself and my colleague Peter Pedroni. The URLs that are there at the bottom of the screen, c-3d.org/slides.pdf or paper.pdf can be used to download on your smartphone or anything that'll read Acrobat. A copy of these slides and a copy of the paper. So what's motivating this research is probably what's motivating most of you for being in this room. Does culture production affect the economy? In some sense, the answer to this is obvious. Culture production is part of the local economy, and when it takes place, it contributes to the level of local economic activity. There have been many studies that demonstrated this, some of the most interesting and important done by folks here in the room and people who are on the panel later on. The point we want to focus on, however, is not just does it affect broadly, but does culture production result? Is there a causal connection between culture production and economic growth? So does an increase in culture, a shock to culture production, result in a change in long-run income? That's really effectively asking, is the creative economy a source or a byproduct of a growing economy? And this is exactly the question Juan was posing and discussing in part of the previous paper. Now, you might say, wait, hasn't this already been demonstrated? I mean, look at this relationship. Here is a graph for 384 MSAs in the U.S. of the relationship between local per capita GDP and per capita arts and culture production in the not-for-profit sector, a clear, unambiguous relationship. Case solved, right? Well, the problem is this relationship exists for many sectors. So here's the relationship between new car dealerships and local per capita GDP. None of us would think, some of us might think, I mean, GM would like to urge us to think that what's good for GM is good for the U.S., and so we should be, like, you know, boosting the local new car dealers, and that will result in additional GDP. But most of us suspect that the reason that this relationship exists is because more affluent communities, more affluent economies, people buy more cars. Correlation does not imply causation. That's the issue that we're confronting. And to sort this out, what we need is a clear model supported by empirical validation that can examine these causal relationships. Now, there have been many studies that have looked at this relationship, input-output models and multipliers look at these. There are a variety of problems with that approach. I don't want to belabor all of those. Some of those are interesting, and they're quite appropriate if our main focus is on the short-run impact. The problem is such approaches do not really address the long-run impact on the economy. So what we want to do in this paper is to present a model that accounts for the opportunity costs associated with culture production. If we devote more resources to culture production, there's going to be fewer resources for something else, because it's a finite world we live in. We want to allow, but not require, that culture causes growth, and then empirically test for this causal relationship. So to do this, we set up what economists would recognize as a classic endogenous growth model that relates income, that is, speaking loosely, that relates the value of goods and services produced in the economy, Y, to the amount of capital available in that economy, K, the amount of culture production, C, and the amount of labor. A scales the factor productivity, so it represents technological change, but in this is an endogenous growth model. We're not using technological change to drive growth. Rather, we're using the accumulation of capital and the production of culture. We're investigating their ability to drive growth in the economy. So in our model, culture production is subject to shocks. So this is the kind of shocks that you might imagine would happen naturally in the world of philanthropy. A large gift comes in an unexpected way, and that can boost culture production in a local community or local economy. That is important for us because we can then observe those shocks to culture production and trace out over time what happens to local GDP. In that way, we can sort out the causal connection between culture production and the prosperity of the local economy. So, do positive shocks to culture generate changes in steady-state income? If we mess around algebraically with the model, and some details of that are in the paper that you can download, we can express the economy, the relationship, as one between per capita GDP as a function of total factor productivity, A. These terms involving S and tau are the shares of local income, local GDP, that are devoted to culture production. So when tau rises, this term, the term there that's got the arrow pointing to it, shares of income devoted to culture, when that rises, more local income is devoted to culture production. And, of course, labor growth is also an important factor. So we're trying to sort out and separate out the effects of culture production from the other things that drive local GDP. In this model, we can show that the log of per capita income and log of culture production have a nice statistical property that's called having a unit root. Econometricians get really excited when they see things have unit root, even more excited when they discover two things that are what's called co-integrated, which means they move randomly, but they tend to move together, intuitively speaking. And it turns out that when series are co-integrated, one must cause the other, or both cause each other. So we're able to show, in fact, that either income causes culture production or culture production causes income to change, or both. And we're going to explore how that process works. What's also true in this model is that there's actually an optimal growth maximizing amount of culture production for the city. So if your whole goal was just to produce economic impact, you can solve for a particular level of culture production, tau star, that would maximize growth. That's not the only reason we support culture production in a society, but there is a growth maximizing level of culture production. And for cities that are below that level, a positive shock to culture is going to increase income. And for cities that are above that level, a positive shock to culture actually could decrease income. So we investigate whether these data are consistent with the model that we've laid out. We test the hypotheses that per capita income and per capita culture production have a unit root and test whether they're integrated. Doing that, it requires us to estimate what's called a co-integrating relationship. This expresses the amount of culture production as a function of the amount of per capita income. And so when we see a large E, a large error term, what that means is you've identified a city with more culture production than you would expect given its income. That then gets used, that observation gets used in estimating what's called an error correction model, and from that error correction model, we can determine the direction of causality and the significance of the impacts. We use data that we've obtained from the NCCS for cultural nonprofits localized to each city. This represents the time series of data. We have information for 384 MSAs in the U.S., and we look at total culture production as measured by the total expenditures of all arts and culture nonprofits located within the MSA. If you're an econometrician, you'll get and do panel time series econometrics, you'll be all excited and interested in these statistics. But let me just tell you that all of the stars next to those tests imply that all the tests show that the data are consistent with the predictions of our model. So it suggests that these data are appropriate to apply this model to. We can then test causality, and the details of this test are in the paper, but I can tell you that these tests imply that there is a pervasive causal connection between per capita culture production and per capita GDP in U.S. metropolitan economies. The direction is unambiguous that income causes culture, but also there's evidence that culture causes income. When we apply the sign test, this sign test that we have, what we're able to establish is that for the majority of U.S. metropolitan areas, a positive shock to culture generates an increase in per capita GDP. And this is actually a causal connection because it tracks in time. So we're able to analyze it by using information over time. So, I don't know if I've, great, I'm on schedule for my conclusion slide. What do we establish? First, there is a clear short-run relationship between culture production and economic output that's obvious from the fact that culture production is part of the economy. Neither that relationship nor the overall size of the cultural sector, however, implies that increases in art support will necessarily cause economic growth or increases in long-run GDP. Evaluation of that requires a new type of model and data analysis that goes over time so that we can trace out these impacts. In this paper, we provide a growth model in which these shocks to culture might generate economic growth. Using data from U.S. arts and culture nonprofits, we find that the data are consistent with the predictions of our model, that arts and culture production has a pervasive causal impact on steady-state income or GDP in metropolitan economies. Therefore, a positive shock to culture production causes economic growth in the overall sample of cities. That won't necessarily be true in subsets of cities, and the paper itself includes some information about how that breaks down in particular regional contexts, and we're investigating in other contexts. So in this sense, we can truly say that art works. Okay, thank you.
Good morning. Well, you heard Juan talk about the need for and the provision of a theoretical connection between the arts and the local economy. So there is a first step, at least, toward fleshing out what we've acknowledged for quite some time has been a shortcoming. What is really the theoretical connection? And you heard Steve talk about a need for a follow-up looking at more of a longer-term perspective, some more time series research. The good news is that I do have a little bit of that. The bad news is that I can't offer much more confirming evidence than he does, but at least we're beginning to make some strides in that, what I think is the right direction. So this research, the arts as a growth engine, actually has quite a long history. I began doing this back in the early 90s, partly as a response to what at the time, as you will see as we proceed into this presentation, the contention that the arts were in fact a growth engine, and that simply by funding more of the arts, the local economies throughout the country would prosper, and the arts would be a cause of that. Well, economists tend not to, well, we're skeptics. We are natural skeptics. We think in terms of, what do we sacrifice to do that? Is there really a theoretical foundation for what you're claiming to be the case? But we didn't do much testing of those claims back in the very early days. So the economic impact of the arts is a significant element of historic arts advocacy. It still is an element of arts advocacy. And early on, it was founded on what is known as the export-based theory, whereby spending on the arts in a local economy has some multiplier effects that work their way through the rest of the economy. And this little equation simply says that total employment or other indicators of economic activity in a local economy is some multiple of arts-based economic activity in that area. And you'll be hearing some more about the export-based approach as we proceed through the day. Some fundamental drawbacks of this approach. The first is the assumption that the arts sector is part of the export base. That is to say that people come to a community specifically to purchase arts-related services. And yes, that happens. But is that significant enough to count as a cause of local economic growth? The second piece of an economist's response to this is that even if it's true, does it really justify a subsidy? And if it does justify subsidy, well, there are other sectors of the economy which are much more important in terms of promoting local economic growth. Does that suggest that they should be subsidized as well? And finally, if we're focusing on this as a subsidy argument, are we diverting attention from sounder reasons for subsidizing the arts? And I term this, by the way, since it just doesn't go away, as the zombie justification. Well, the next stage in the effort to link the arts to local economic activity is what we call the quality of life argument, and you heard Juan sketch this out as well. The idea is that the arts, as part of the local quality of life in a community, attracts and retains employees in the community. But the preponderance of evidence suggests that business decisions are focused on other important factors, whether there's a skilled workforce, whether there's access to markets or access to suppliers, and the extent to which the local governments provide infrastructure investments. The most recent approach, which is the focus of our symposium today, is the endogenous growth aspect. And I provided here a somewhat simpler version of Steve's more complex growth model, or production function as it is presented here, where it simply states that local economic activity or local output, signified by Q here, is some function of the capital and labor, and then I have an A there as an augmentation by the arts community. Now, one of the issues that has arisen in the so-called new growth theory is that it's subject to increasing returns. Well, economists like for things to settle down to an equilibrium growth path. It enables us to use our mathematics to predict some outcomes. And one of the realities of the new growth theory is that things do not, in fact, settle down to an equilibrium growth path, that things are what are sometimes referred to as state-dependent, that random shocks can generate effects that don't wash out over time, but in fact can amplify over time. And that might be, and I'll give you a little bit of an advanced look here, that might account at least in part for some of the diverse results that we find in our research. So You'll hear Richard Florida's name mentioned several times again during the day, because his work back in the early 2000s did in fact reinvigorate the economic impact arguments, shifted them a bit away from the old export base approach to something very different. He does mention one of the prime drivers, Paul Romer, of the new growth theory, but he mentions it only in passing. So I would have to contend that while Florida's work is certainly challenging and stimulating, we can't really conclude that it is firmly based in our subject matter today. Nonetheless, arts advocates, including many of you, found this to be a very attractive aspect to incorporate in our advocacy activities. However, we have up to this point had uncertain theoretical and empirical support for this. And I wish I could say that as a result of today's work and the things that you will hear, we've solved that problem. We're making progress. So here's the question that I pursued. And you've heard this mentioned already, you'll hear it mentioned a few more times before the day is over, does the arts sector in some sense cause local economic growth, or is the arts sector a response to local economic growth? The latter of those two is the traditional economics perspective. The former of those two might be incorporated into the new economic development approach. So the way it's phrased here is that the export base approach, the arts sector, if the arts is basic and the arts stimulates visitors to a community who will purchase arts services and products, is an element of the larger export base, then that should cause, in a sense, or it should drive overall economic activity, signified here by E sub T. On the other hand, if the arts, as part of a growth-stimulating culture sector, drives local economic growth, then we'd have the arrow indicated pointing to the Q in the second bullet-pointed equation. I used a technique that has been around in economics for quite a long time now. It has resulted in someone else winning a Nobel Prize. But I'm not hesitant about riding on those coattails. So the question becomes, how much of current economic activity can be explained by past values of current economic activity? And then is that enhanced by putting in the arts sector as a supplementary representation of cause? Without burdening you with the processes and techniques themselves, I'll simply note that if the economic base is a sound approach, the export base is a sound approach to explaining local economic activity, then within a fairly short period of time, we should have some indication that the arts are having an impact on the local economy. If, however, if we adopt the endogenous growth approach, the new growth theory approach, it takes far more time for that to work its way out. And I'm using a longer time period. The time periods that I use are years. And so I'm looking at whether there is, over a fairly short period of time of 4 years, whether that's sufficient for a stimulus, an arts-generated stimulus, to work its way through the local economy and show an impact. Over 8 years, does arts-related economic activity generate enough of an impact on local growth to show up? I used 15 metropolitan areas, and I used income by source, where I could approximate the arts-related income with 3 aggregations of sectors. I looked at entertainment, which is not exactly the arts. I looked at movies, which is borderline the arts, and I looked at museums, zoos. Well, the zoos artistic, well, they're grouped together with museums, and so on. So using those sectors and linking those to the local economies in these metropolitan areas listed alphabetically. Of course, now I live in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis-St. Paul. I knew what I expected to happen there. And here are the results. So just summarizing the consequences here. Is there evidence of arts-induced export base impact? And in 5 of the 15 metropolitan areas, there was such evidence. Dallas, Houston, Minneapolis, St. Paul, New York City, and Philadelphia. And intuitively, I think we can understand some of these. New York City and Broadway just makes some sense that some of us travel to New York City and go to Broadway shows for the purpose of attending those Broadway productions and other arts amenities, to go to MoMA, to go to the Met, and so on. Philadelphia makes some sense, I think, to most of us, because as the seat of our historical development, has a number of cultural amenities that we visit over the years. Dallas and Houston, I'm still working on exactly what's going on there. Minneapolis, St. Paul, I like to think, and of course this is purely anecdotal, and it's fostered by a number of decades of living there. Founded by Nordic folks who were indoors much of the year and needed something to do, and so of course developed those artistic amenities. Is there evidence of arts-induced endogenous growth? Well, in 3 of the 15 metropolitan areas, there's evidence of that. Atlanta, Dallas, and Minneapolis, St. Paul. Dallas shows up again for reasons, again, I'm working with. And the Twin Cities, well, of course. The local cultural community does, in fact, if it doesn't attract, it certainly retains businesses, and we get a lot of strong evidence from local business leaders that that is the case. Evidence that the arts respond to growth, this is the predominant outcome, that the arts respond to increases in local economic activity, increases in local ability to spend, and a lot of that spending goes on the arts. We think of the arts as what we call, however necessary the arts are in your life, economists do find that they act as what we call luxury goods. That as our income rises, spending on the arts goes up faster on a percentage basis. So, not powerful evidence, but lots of opportunity to plumb the depths further. What needs to be done? I'd like to do this on additional metropolitan areas. Maybe not quite as many as Steve. I don't have that much time before retirement to collect that much data. I'd like to experiment some more with sectoral definitions and data access. There are some lingering data shortcomings, including the fact that because of disclosure rules, we don't always get all the data for all the counties and all the metropolitan areas, especially as metropolitan areas grow, and trying to get historical data for those. And then I'd like to explore some more control variables. What else is happening? So we have some evidence for some cities of arts having an impact, more evidence for more metropolitan areas of the arts being responsive to local economic activity. Thank you.
Okay. So show of hands, how many people took economics in college? That's pretty impressive. How many people have graduate degrees in economics? Well, I was going to say that this seems to be a much more economically based group. Welcome to Brookings. You know? I found that an absolutely fascinating set of presentations. Past the methodology bit, but what I'd like to do, and then open up for questions, is, because I know everyone had a chance to talk with each other yesterday about, obviously, the methodology, but also the findings. And before I ask a series of questions, were there any sort of outcomes from those conversations among the 3 of you in terms of what you found? Any sort of clear common ground, either about the starting theory or about some of the findings? I mean, at Brookings, we will always say we need more research. These are American jobs, right? But But any sort of insights from the conversations you all had yesterday, either during the day, I know you had a dinner together, that you might want to share with the audience?
Actually, regretfully, I wasn't able to make it to
Okay,
yesterday.
then
So,
you can hypothesize, though.
we have already been talking about
Okay.
this. So.
Anyone else want?
I'll take a shot at least a piece of it. And actually, Steve mentioned something which I think we might be looking for. He mentioned shocks to the local economy, and it would be nice if we could find sort of natural experiments and track the results of such shocks. And I'm actually have something that I'm pursuing, which I think might turn out to be something close to that. Some of you may be aware that as a result of a misguided political position of a former governor of Minnesota, who, by the way, was a failed presidential candidate, whose position was no new taxes. And the electorate said, oh, yes, we're going to have new taxes. And the electorate proposed and enacted an amendment to the Minnesota State Constitution, thereby effectively overriding the no new taxes stance of the former governor. A piece of that amendment, which is known as the Legacy Amendment, was funding dedicated to art and culture. It happened to be one of those odd bedfellows, political bedfellows things. The arts advocates united with environmentalists and hunters to divide up the proceeds of the new taxes. But we will be tracking the impact of the revenues raised and the types of spending in local communities throughout Minnesota. So we have at least the option of an experiment.
Very interesting. What I enjoyed about these presentations was the ability to disaggregate what could be a very large, almost simplistic conversation about the impact, causation, correlation, arts and culture in the economy, into these different sort of buckets, essentially. Traction, retention, the spillovers, export versus response. The question about arts and culture, I mean, you said, for example, one of the criticisms of the creative class work, and Richard's not here to defend himself, but we can call him up, maybe he'll live tweet, is that it has sort of an almost monolithic kind of sense and sort of mixing and matching up of lawyers, engineers, designers, people we would regard as pure artists, right? So very large class. The same way, I'd like just to get your sense, in a particular city, and everyone here has their own sense of, whether in England or in the United States, arts and culture covers many different kinds of large interventions, right? The museums, the cultural institutions, the entertainment sector, and then very small kind of firms, individuals, free agents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the most persistent questions we get, and I think your research is beginning to help us sort through this a bit better, is how do you distinguish between support for either legacy or continued for these large cultural institutions, and particularly the buildings, right? I mean, you can go to many places in the United States and see a spurt of performing art facilities being built, and the sort of smaller interventions, right? Probably less costly at the end of the day, but less predictive. Hard to get your arms around it, right? There's no ribbon to cut, So how do you think about that? Because I think it sort of disaggregates even further what is this large arts and culture kind of cluster. Any thoughts?
One of the advantages, it's both an advantage and a shortcoming of our Culture 24 data set, is just a self-selecting database that doesn't account for the size of the cultural institution which is registering.
I see.
So we literally have there from communities, organizations running on a shoestring to very large and well-funded museums, and we're still finding an impact on that variable. It's not really looking at the amount of employment on cultural sectors in a given place. It's just looking at what's going on in terms of cultural institutions registering for the data set. And as the results suggest, as I said, tentatively, we're finding both effects in terms of this apparent compensating differential as well as the spillovers between, again, tentative spillovers between arts and cultural activity and creative occupation wages.
Yeah. We've been very interested in trying to disaggregate, as you said, and look at the impacts on the local economy that result from different types of arts and cultural organizations. We are constrained because we've been working with nonprofit data, so we're kind of leaving aside the commercial sector. But a large hunk of arts and culture production is happening within the nonprofit world in the U.S. So with the available data that's coming from the 990s that we can get, we can separate out impacts of performing arts, visual arts, and other arts organizations. We've undertaken some preliminary investigations of that. And we can also just broadly separate them into groups of big organizations, small organizations. It would be really great to sort out the capital expenditure impacts from the operating expenditure impacts. That's a little less reliably extractable from the 990 information, but to the extent that it's there, we could look at that. We haven't looked at the capital versus operating.
Yeah, this really raises the larger data availability question.
Right.
And there's two kinds of implications of that for economic impact analyses. The data availability, for example, Steve's working with nonprofit data from the Form 990s. Until last year, very small organizations never had to file a 990, yet in the aggregate they can be significant in a local economy. They get lost entirely, and suddenly it's a shock to the system, but it's a legislatively induced shock or policy-induced shock rather than a natural economic development kind of shock. The other aspect that I think is worth thinking about is, you talked about aggregating data, and we've talked about aggregating across sectors and so on. But there really are several other dimensions, and I'll just mention two. One is the difference between how the arts and cultural sector impacts the local economy as a whole, and where are the boundaries of the art and cultural sector, about which there's some disagreement, and then how does an arts district impact the location of economic activity within a community, which is a very different question. Both of those have impacts for the quality of life in a community.
Very interesting. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, first, let me second every social scientist's complaint of, yes, more data would be helpful. And, for example, the ability to bring in the commercial sector. With the 990 information, though, because that has ZIP+4s for virtually all organizations, we can look at clusters within urban areas, and we're just starting analysis of that to look at how whether having clustered versus dispersed arts and culture production has a different impact on long-run GDP in the cities.
Well, let me ask you this question, because I was in Ohio yesterday, and Brookings released a study on the spatial geography of manufacturing. Okay, a completely different kind of cluster, though obviously involves many creative people, particularly in the industrial design community, right? If you think about the cluster, so let's just focus on Northeast Ohio for a second. Very large firms, sort of your base. You've got this sort of network of small and medium-sized firms that are the suppliers to the large firms. And then you've got this ecosystem. It's a very rich ecosystem of advanced research institutions, of labor skilling intermediaries, right, that are sort of feeder systems into the firms, advocacy organizations. I mean, it's really interesting about how rich and textured that cluster is. So we're calling this a cluster of sorts, right? But as you think about the broader economy, is there something different about how arts and culture operates? Is it an ecosystem, right? It seems a bit different from automotive or aerospace or high-precision medical devices, which is a big cluster, obviously, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and so forth and so on. So is there something different about this? And would that affect, ultimately, results in terms of economic impact and so forth?
I'm actually involved in a project, a 2-year project, looking at the creative, digital, and cultural cluster in Brighton, which is where I live, as I said.
Sure.
And it's very much going to be looking at these sorts of issues, including testing hypotheses about the extent to which arts, skills, resources, and so forth are complementary with more conventional commercially creative and digital resources, as well as the extent to which the network is connected. That is, we find arts and cultural organizations working with creative commercial companies in the way in which you would expect a cluster to behave.
Right.
Anecdotal evidence suggests a connection, also not in terms of labor flows and also in terms of trade.
I mean, there has to be some impact of clustering in arts and culture production because we observe a lot of clustering.
Right.
I mean, even in that region, in Toledo is a great example where the Toledo Museum of Art is located, has been there for a long time. Right next to it is built the University of Toledo's art school. And so, we see this over and over again in metropolitan areas, clustering of production of different types of cultural activities. What's a little unclear, but is a great question to be investigating, is what is the impact of that clustering? How does that clustering affect the way that arts and culture affects the metropolitan economy? And how does that clustering affect the success or struggling sustainability of the cultural organizations themselves? Getting a handle on what that incentive is to cluster. It's a great question. I think we're starting to be able to look at that. We've done a little work, again, with the nonprofit data. There's been lots of stuff, of course, looking at arts and culture districts. I mean, the NEA sponsored some of that stuff.
There's something that we sometimes lose track of, I suspect, when we're comparing, say, manufacturing with the arts. Manufacturing firms very often are multi-site firms.
Right.
Arts organizations almost always are single-site firms. So, for example, a decision made in Detroit has a powerful impact in St. Paul, Minnesota, to close the Ford plant there. There are no decisions made in Detroit that have an impact on the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. We have not yet, I suspect, done enough work on the nature of the local arts industry. In fact, I'm only aware of a single such study, an in-depth analysis of an arts industry, and that was in a Dutch, a smaller Dutch community. And nothing, to my knowledge, yet has been done in the U.S., and that probably is something we need to remedy.
Another question, and then folks should get ready. I left my iPhone upstairs, so this is a BlackBerry, right? It's just not. I hope this doesn't go out of service because I like the way it's raised, so you can type. But anyway, we see how fast things happen in this world today. I find what's remarkable over the past literally 5 years of how much visual design has entered our everyday lives, right? And it just strikes me that as we try to assess the impacts of arts and culture, and maybe this is just a segment of the arts and cultural community, this spillover issue, right? If we look back, may not have as dramatic of an effect, but as we begin to think about the effect of these mobile devices and iPads and all the rest of it on our lives, it seems like there's almost an acceleration of the interplay of design and communication and how it fundamentally affects how firms across multiple sectors not just think about how they communicate and brand and extend their reach, but how they actually do their work. And so that sort of leads you to think that whatever we're observing today, if we play out this over the next 10 or 15 years, and obviously we're not talking about everywhere in the United States, but we're talking about a very specific set of places, we could be seeing much bigger observable effects. And I just want to, are we living in such a disruptive and dynamic period that we have to reassess or maybe just come back and get more clear and granular about how we think about this interplay. Thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is true that the importance of design has injected itself in a big way in terms of personal electronic devices and communications devices and that sort of thing. But design, of course,
right.
I mean, urban design has been important in how we live our lives for centuries. Fashion has been important in how we signal to each other status and interest and et cetera. So it may be that there are stages at which a particular industry or group of consumption items mature to where design is ready to become an important factor in helping us decide how, where, and in what ways to use particular objects.
But this is ubiquitous in many ways. I mean, this cuts across class, race, ethnicity in a way that urban design, I don't think, ever has, right? I mean, this is now a platform for how we all live our lives and how companies operate. It just strikes me as a radical shift, and then allows for these spillovers, allows for this mashup of clusters in ways that we may not have anticipated before or experienced before.
And some of the research that Nesta has done has looked at the extent to which one finds people from creative occupations working outside the conventionally defined creative industries, using the Department for Culture, Media and Sports definition, and we find that 60% are working outside the creative industries. They are what we call embedded creative professionals working elsewhere in the economy. Designers, musicians, all sorts of advertising, of course.
So there's hope for my daughter, is really what you're telling me.
Well, and I think what is definitely true is when design becomes important, then of necessity clustering is important.
Right.
Because then we're learning so much just by being in proximity to each other and to the goods themselves.
And we should acknowledge the symbiotic relationship. There was this wonderful piece in Business Week not too long ago about an auto parts designer who lost his job when the industry shrank. The industry is beginning to grow again. He got an offer of a new job, but in the very short time that he was unemployed, technology changed entirely. The design technology, he had to totally retrain.
Open up for questions. Now, I have specifically avoided any methodological questions, right? But if anyone in this audience is so moved, please feel free. Question over here.
Sure, thanks. Thanks very much. This is very interesting.
And identify yourself if you can.
I'm going to identify myself. I am Stephen Canna. I am one of those people who raised his hand as an economist with all 3 degrees. I worked for the Treasury Department and the U.S. Council for International Business, and now I'm retired. You all raise interesting points, particularly Professor Shepard about opportunity costs you mentioned, and Professor Gray talked about whether it's a driver of growth or a recipient of growth. Which brings us back to sort of some economic principles. And that is, if I could take you out of the weeds, when we allocate resources, we allocate resources through the price mechanism. And prices reflect relative relationships, not absolute relationships. So, gentlemen, in this area of scarce resources today, if you are the mayor of a city or the head of a city council, and the head of the arts council comes to you and says, we want to spend $5 million to extend the museum. And the parents of the PTA come to you and say, no, we want to spend $5 million to have more class time, AP math, phys ed so our kids are not overweight and get near diabetic. How do you choose? I would put to you that you cannot ignore this aspect of work, of the relative price of the arts and the benefits which they convey to our economy and our society versus the other claim on resources. I'd be interested in your comments.
Great question.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, and it's exactly what our paper's about. So all I can say is, please, go to the URL. Okay, well, let me just say it is exactly what motivated us to do this research? And I think the answer is there are broad classes of cities in which the mayor, if the mayor's primary concern is maximizing the economic output of the metropolitan region, there are large classes of cities for which the answer is yes, we should go ahead and put money for the arts, and that may mean less for the classrooms, or less for roadways, or less for some other bit of infrastructure. There are other classes of cities for which that's not true, and where the money, again, for purposes of maximizing local GDP, where the money would be more appropriately spent on infrastructure development. And by developing and estimating these models, we can identify the class of activities, the class of cities, the characteristics that will provide guidance. Of course, maximizing GDP isn't the only reason we support the arts, but as an input to the decision-making process, we can provide that.
Bruce, the question you asked, and you mentioned two specific sectors for comparison, it actually is I think it is the single most significant question confronting the entire nonprofit sector, or set of sectors, subsectors at the moment. And if one goes to research symposia, seminar, and the like, scholars who explore the nonprofit sector, the sessions on social impact analysis are typically the most heavily attended. And that's where much of the foundation funding is going now, to try to get a sense of how they, as good stewards of the funds entrusted to them, are using it as well as possible. And so there is an expectation that every applicant for funding is going to have some means of demonstrating social impact analysis, which comes closer to making the kind of comparison. And of course, these comparisons are necessary because presumably public and nonprofit organizations exist because of some kind of market failure and a failure of the price system to reflect adequately the values.
Great question. Anne had a question over here. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I didn't raise this yesterday, but it's particularly for Stephen and Juan. I'm interested in the intra-metropolitan distribution and results, and I think both of you use cities, right? So I'm just wondering about what we would call spatial autocorrelation. And obviously, most of us observe that there are high concentrations of nonprofit arts organizations in the central cities and sometimes the inner ring suburbs, and a real dearth of them in areas farther out, and also that is also replicated in the pattern of location of individual artists. And I'm just wondering, in your econometrics, how did you deal, because a lot of these are next door to each other, and how did you deal with that at all, trying to account for the interrelationship, the fact that some of the people in the suburbs are patronizing the activities in these bigger central cities?
I mean, we have controls for population density, but that doesn't address the key issues with spatial autocorrelation. This is one, actually, that we were planning to address going forward, because we will be able to have access to very finely grained, the Culture 24 data is very finely grained, it's postcode level, and we should also be able to access data for creative firms at that level. So we'll be addressing it.
But England doesn't count. Just from you haven't sprawled as much. I mean, come to America and start driving. It'll just take you days to get to. No, man, there's some sprawl, but I'm just kidding.
The greater southeast is basically.
Well, southeast is beginning to look like us, unfortunately. Yeah.
So in our analysis, you're exactly right. Our unit of analysis is the MSA,
right,
which is a multi-county area. So it includes the suburbs as well as the central city. It's not the city of St. Louis or the city of Cleveland. It's the St. Louis MSA. But as you know, because we were on a panel last year together, we are working using these data to analyze the clustering within the MSA, because that information is available to us from the 990. So ask me in a year.
I had a question over here. Just mix it up a bit, right in the middle there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm John Pender. I'm an economist working on rural development issues at USDA. Just on the issue of new growth theory, my familiarity with it kind of tells me, it makes me struggle a little bit with seeing how this relates to the arts, because as I understand new growth theory, the essential aspect of it is that there's an increasing returns to scale. And so I don't quite see the mechanisms, really. I mean, if there's some kind of spillover effects, as Juan was saying, maybe that's where you get this increasing returns, but it's not obvious to me what the mechanism is of those spillovers, or that they would be geographically based. And then if you have the other kind of explanation that Juan was talking about with this sort of Richard Florida effect, attracting, the amenities and attracting people, then it's not clear that you would have increasing returns in that case. So I guess, so my question is is there a way to distinguish between these different effects? And, are you really seeing an increasing returns, or just something that's attracting people to communities, and maybe that's benefiting that community, but it may not be helping nearby communities? So can I add in one other question, just related to rural areas? I wonder, is anybody looking at these issues in rural areas? And I think of places like the Blues Highway in the Mississippi Delta, for example. Right. Is there any evidence on cultural investments such as that having an economic impact?
Just one quick answer on the rural bit is about half of people who live in quote-unquote rural areas live in metropolitan areas because we've sprawled out so far. Yeah. So it gets to Ann's question about the intra-metropolitan kind of question. For the other part of rural America, that would require some additional studies. Any response on either one of those questions?
Two things. One, with the nonprofit data, we can actually look at location and development of the arts and culture production in truly non-metropolitan areas, and we've played around a little with that. One of the difficulties of trying to undertake the analysis that we've done for this is the difficulty of getting solid measures of the aggregate level of economic activity for very rural areas, because of the number of establishments will be small, data suppression issues keep it from being reported at the county level. But in principle, it's doable. One thing I want to observe about the growth theory, I mean, part of what distinguishes the growth theory that lies behind our model is in distinction. The older growth models of Solow and others were getting growth from assumptions about the rate of technological progress. And what we're doing is not assuming that technological progress is driving growth, but rather that capital and culture production can drive growth, and looking at accumulations in those areas. So the model is set up, and it's completely a simple adaptation of Barrow's endogenous growth model. So it really is about modeling capital accumulation and culture production as a way of driving growth rather than technological change.
Yeah, I would just add to that we're looking at a type of capital that doesn't get used up over time. It's still there, whether you call it cultural capital or artistic capital. It's available to everybody. One person's utilization doesn't diminish anybody else's access to it. So it has that important attribute in this context.
Maybe last question. Maybe go in the back, right back there. Just perfect.
Jonathan Katz, I direct the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. I was intrigued by the concept of a positive shock, which I suppose could also be called an investment. And I wondered if in your research you noticed any threshold at which that shock makes a difference, or any increments in which that shock makes a difference, because we do see that in arts education, and we do see that in health benefits for arts activities. So I wondered if you see that in your economic models.
That is a great question. We haven't investigated it, but in principle, we could, try to look for something about the magnitude of the shock. The data don't allow us to sort out whether the shock is from, say, an idiosyncratic change in public policy through state arts funding, or an idiosyncratic philanthropic move or gift. But we could conceivably look for threshold effects. We just haven't investigated it.
Yeah, just to add on to that, we probably need more natural experiments to track, and we need, I guess, academically to be rewarded for case studies.
That concludes this panel. We've got about a 10-minute break. People come back. The next panel starts around 10:40, 10:45. Please thank the panelists. Excellent.
Thank you.